In 1922, British archaeologist Leonard Woolley broke through the seal of a tomb at Ur and found something that didn't fit. Not the gold, not the lapis lazuli beads, not the ceremonial weapons or the elaborate headdress that would later appear in every archaeology textbook covering ancient Mesopotamia. What didn't fit was the body itself. The king's name was Meskalamdug. We know this from a golden helmet found in the burial chamber, inscribed with his title. Not prince consort, not military commander, king. He ruled in his own capacity around 2600 BCE, and when bioarchaeologists examined his skeletal remains decades after the initial excavation, they noted something unusual in their reports. His skull showed characteristics that placed it outside the expected parameters for the Sumerian population of that period. The measurements were recorded, the anomaly was documented. Then the academic literature moved on to discuss the gold work. I want you to understand what was actually found in that tomb before we talk about what it might mean. Woolley's excavation revealed not just the king's burial chamber, but a death pit containing 63 individuals, soldiers, attendants, court officials. The physical evidence suggests they entered the tomb alive, consumed poison, and arranged themselves in deliberate positions to die alongside their ruler. Some still gripped weapons, some wore ceremonial dress. This wasn't chaos. This was organized voluntary death on a scale that demands explanation. 63 people chose to follow one man into whatever they believed came next. What did they see in him that made that choice possible? What authority did he represent that inspired that level of commitment? When you read the original bioarchaeological reports, the ones that don't make it into museum displays, you find details that complicate the standard narrative. Meskalamdug's skull wasn't just unusual, it was elongated in a way that the examining researchers specifically noted as atypical, not subtly different, measurably outside the normal range. The mainstream explanation for elongated skulls in ancient contexts is cranial binding, wrapping an infant's head to deliberately reshape it as the skull develops. This is a real practice. We have evidence of it from Peru, from parts of Africa, from several pre-Columbian cultures in North America. It's not controversial to say that ancient peoples modified skull shapes for cultural or status reasons. But here's what cranial binding can and cannot do. It can reshape bone. It can change the profile, alter the silhouette, create a dramatically different appearance. What it cannot do is increase the total interior volume of the skull. Brain tissue volume is genetically determined. You can stretch a skull into an elongated form through binding, but the space inside won't exceed what that individual's genetics allow. Some ancient skulls are different, not all of them. I'm being specific here because the evidence varies case by case and needs to be treated accordingly. But some skulls from ancient contexts show interior volumes that exceed normal human parameters, not reshaped to the same volume, larger in absolute terms. Cranial binding doesn't produce that result. A skull that's both elongated in shape and volumetrically larger than the human norm requires a different explanation, and mainstream scholarship hasn't provided a consensus answer for cases where this volumetric anomaly appears. I don't know if Meskalamdug's skull falls into that category. The reports note the elongation but don't provide the level of detailed measurement that would confirm or rule out a volumetric difference. That's where this stops being just an interesting historical footnote. In 2010, a formal request was made to the Natural History Museum in London, where Meskalamdug's remains are held, asking that his genome be sequenced. The request came from Zechariah Sitchin, and whatever you think about his broader theories, the request itself made scientific sense. Ancient DNA extraction is a mature field. We've sequenced Neanderthal genomes from bones 40,000 years old. We've reconstructed genetic profiles of Bronze Age Europeans, ancient Egyptians, populations from across the prehistoric world. The technology exists. The expertise exists. The institutional infrastructure exists. The museum declined. Sitchin died later that year. No institution has revisited the request in the 15 years since. the most famous Sumerian king ever excavated, a ruler whose burial involved 63 voluntary deaths, whose physical remains show documented skeletal anomalies, who governed during a period when such individual authority was essentially unprecedented, has never had his genome sequenced, not attempted and failed, not attempted and deemed inconclusive, simply not done. The remains are in London. The technology is readily available. The scientific value of sequencing DNA from a 3rd millennium BCE Sumerian royal would be extraordinary. It could tell us about ancient Mesopotamian population genetics, migration patterns, the genetic composition of the ruling class. This isn't a marginal research question. Ancient DNA from this period and region is exceptionally rare and valuable. So why hasn't it happened? That question leads somewhere I didn't expect when I started looking into this. Because Meskalamdug's skull doesn't exist in isolation. There's a pattern here that crosses continents and millennia, appearing in contexts that shouldn't be connected. The Amarna period in Egypt. Roughly 1350 BCE, Pharaoh Akhenaten, the so-called heretic king who dismantled the traditional Egyptian pantheon and instituted monotheistic worship of the Aten, appears in statuary and relief carvings with a skull shape that defies normal human proportions. His wife Nefertiti shows the same characteristics. Their daughters appear in intimate family scenes with identical cranial profiles. The standard academic explanation points to artistic convention, a deliberate aesthetic choice reflecting the unique Amarna style. Stylized royal iconography, nothing more. Except Akhenaten's actual mummy tells a different story. The elongation isn't just in the art, it's in the bone. Physical anthropologists examining remains from this family have documented unusual skeletal features that cluster in statistically improbable ways. Elongated skulls, feminized bone structure in male family members, characteristics that shouldn't appear together in an isolated population. These aren't artistic liberties. They're physical realities preserved in the archaeological record. Move to Peru. The Paracas skulls, a collection of elongated crania found on the Paracas Peninsula dating back 3,000 years. Some show volumetric measurements outside normal human parameters. Brian Forrester and others have publicised these extensively, sometimes with more enthusiasm than rigour, granted. But strip away the sensationalism and look at the museum records themselves. The underlying measurements show anomalies that cranial binding simply doesn't account for. These aren't reshapes, they're structural differences. Back to Mesopotamia. The Ubaid figurines, those pre-Sumerian clay figures with elongated reptilian skulls created 8,000 years ago. The people making these weren't depicting monsters. They integrated these beings into domestic scenes, showed them nursing infants. The elongated skull wasn't alien to them. It was familiar, intimate, part of their understood reality. What connects Ubaid figurines from 5,500 BCE Iraq, Meskalamdug's anomalous skull from 2,500 BCE Ur, Akhenaten's elongated cranium from 1350 BCE Egypt, and the Paracas skulls from ancient Peru? I'm not drawing conclusions. The geographic spread alone makes any single explanation nearly impossible to sustain. These populations had no documented contact. They're separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. Yet this specific physical feature keeps appearing in the ruling class, in the priestly class, in figures identified as divine or semi-divine, in objects of devotion created by cultures that left no other record of what they were actually worshipping. Elongated skulls associated with power and divinity appear across the ancient world in contexts that can't be explained by a single regional practice. That's not interpretation. That's observation. The pattern exists whether we can explain it or not. Meskalamdug's remains have been in London for over a century. His skull anomaly was recorded during excavation and discussed in subsequent literature. We're now in an era where researchers routinely extract DNA from bones far older, far more degraded, far less historically significant than a Sumerian king buried with 63 attendants. His genome remains unsequenced, unpublished, simply not done. What would his DNA reveal about his ancestry? What population does he belong to? Is his genome consistent with the general Sumerian population of his time? Does it show something unexpected, a different genetic profile that would demand explanation? We don't know. Not because the question can't be answered, because it hasn't been asked. In an era when answering it would be relatively straightforward, that absence isn't neutral. It's a choice distributed across institutions, funding bodies, research priorities. A choice that has left one of the most significant Sumerian rulers in history genetically invisible. His golden helmet is reconstructed and displayed. His image appears in textbooks. The story of his burial, the lapis lazuli, the 63 dead attendants, gets told in museums worldwide as a window into Sumerian royal culture. The questions about his skull aren't in those museums. The questions about his genome aren't in those textbooks. The technology exists. The remains are accessible. The scientific value would be immense. And yet, nothing happens. Somewhere in a climate-controlled storage facility in London sit the bones of a man who ruled ancient Sumer, who inspired 63 people to die alongside him, whose skull was documented as physically unusual and then set aside, whose genome has never been read. He's been available for study longer than most living scientists have been alive. We just haven't looked at the parts that might prove difficult to explain, the parts that might connect to a pattern we're not quite ready to acknowledge, a pattern that spans continents and millennia, appearing in the remains of those who held power when civilization was young, when the line between human and something else might not have been as clear as we now assume it was. I want to show you something that changes when you actually start asking these questions in public, not hypothetically, in reality. In 2010, Zecharia Sitchin made a formal request to the Natural History Museum in London. He asked them to sequence Queen Puabi's genome. The request was scientifically reasonable, regardless of what you think about his broader theories. Ancient DNA extraction is a mature field now. We've sequenced Neanderthal genomes from bones 40,000 years old. We've reconstructed genetic profiles of ancient Egyptians, Bronze Age Europeans, populations from across the prehistoric world. The museum declined. No formal explanation. Sitchin died later that year. The request died with him. That was 15 years ago. In those 15 years, the technology has only gotten better. More accessible, more routine. And Queen Puabi, the most famous Sumerian royal ever excavated, a woman whose physical remains show documented skeletal anomalies, whose burial involved 74 voluntary deaths, who ruled alone when that was essentially unprecedented, has never had her genome sequenced. Not attempted and failed. Not attempted and inconclusive. Simply not attempted. But here's what I find genuinely difficult to reconcile. Meskalamdug, the Sumerian king we discussed earlier, sits in that same museum. Same time period, same royal cemetery, same type of documented skull anomaly, same extraordinary burial circumstances with dozens of attendants choosing death. His genome hasn't been sequenced either. Neither has been studied genetically despite being available for over a century. Despite the technology existing, despite the scientific value being immense for understanding ancient Mesopotamian population genetics, migration patterns, the genetic composition of the ruling class. This isn't one declined request, it's a pattern of non-investigations spanning multiple specimens, multiple institutions, multiple decades. Why does that matter beyond academic curiosity? Because we're living through an era where ancient DNA is rewriting history. Genetics has revealed population movements we had no idea happened. It's shown us that ancient peoples we thought were isolated were actually connected. It's demonstrated mixing between groups separated by thousands of miles. The genetic revolution in archaeology has been one of the most significant developments in the field in the past 20 years. Except apparently when it comes to Sumerian royalty with documented cranial anomalies. The counter-argument is usually diplomatic. These are culturally significant remains. There are ethical considerations. Museums are cautious about destructive analysis, even when the amounts of material required are microscopically small now. That argument might hold weight if it were applied consistently. But it isn't. Ancient royal remains from Egypt, from Europe, from China have been subjected to extensive genetic analysis. The ethical framework exists. The protocols are established. Museums do this work regularly. Just not here. Not with these specific individuals whose skulls were documented as unusual and then catalogued away. You start to notice something when you spend enough time looking at institutional responses to uncomfortable evidence. There's a vocabulary that gets deployed, phrases that sound reasonable but function as conversation enders. Further research is needed. The evidence is inconclusive. This falls outside our current research priorities. We need to be cautious about drawing premature conclusions, all technically true, all functionally identical to saying we're not looking at this. The difference is subtle but significant. Not looking because you lack resources is one thing. Not looking because the question itself is uncomfortable is something else entirely. I can't prove which one applies here. I can only point to the gap between what's technically possible and what's actually being done. Between the questions that could be answered tomorrow with existing technology and existing specimens, and the questions that remain deliberately unasked. Meskalamdug's golden helmet is reconstructed in museum displays worldwide. His burial is taught as evidence of Sumerian royal power and religious devotion. The story gets told, the artifacts get exhibited, the uncomfortable anatomical details get footnoted and filed away. His bones sit in storage, available, accessible, unexamined in the one way that might actually answer whether that skull anomaly means something beyond artistic preference or cultural practice. Same with Queen Puabi. Same with every other Sumerian royal whose remains show similar characteristics. The pattern isn't hidden. It's documented, measured, published in the archaeological literature. What's missing isn't the data. It's the follow-through, the willingness to use modern tools to investigate what that data actually represents. Somewhere in London, in climate-controlled museum storage, sit the remains of individuals who ruled when civilization was being invented, who inspired mass voluntary death among their followers, whose physical characteristics were unusual enough to note and document and then set aside. They've been available for genetic analysis longer than the technology to perform that analysis has existed. The technology caught up. The specimens are still there, and the analysis still hasn't happened. That's not an accident. That's a choice made repeatedly across institutions and decades. A choice that keeps certain questions permanently in the category of interesting but not investigated. The questions about power, about bloodlines, about what made certain individuals different enough to rule in a way that inspired that level of devotion. Those questions could be answered. They just aren't being asked. The bones are there. The technology exists. The questions have been documented for over a century. What we're left with isn't a mystery of ancient history. It's a mystery of modern silence. The gap between what we could know and what we're willing to investigate tells its own story about how we decide which parts of the past are safe to examine and which are easier to leave undisturbed in museum storage.